This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can visit their store by using my referral link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Nezahal, and it's time for another MTG Top 10, the series where I rank cards based on their historical performance and Magic's highest level of competition. Today we're going to take a look at cards that can change hand size. In Magic, the default maximum hand size is 7. This means that at the end of your turn, if you have more than 7 cards, you have to discard cards until you're down to 7. However, there are cards that let you change this rule, either increasing or decreasing the hand size of one or both players. To be eligible for this list, a card had to have an effect that changes at least one player's hand size. In all, there are 43 cards that have one of those types of effects, and in this video I'll be looking at the 10 that have left the biggest impact on competitive Magic. Before we get started, here's a quick reminder on how I score cards in these videos. A first tier top 8 is worth 2 points, this includes events like Pro Tours, and a second tier top 8 is worth 1 point. That includes events like regional championships. Alright, let's take a look at the top 10 cards that can change hand size. At number 10, it's Folio of Fancies. For one generic and a blue, the Folio shuts down both players' hand size restrictions, and it has 2 activated abilities. The first costs XX, and it makes each player draw X cards, and the second costs 2 generic and a blue, and it makes each opponent mill cards equal to the number of cards in their hand. While the hand size restriction being lifted is symmetrical in this case, Folio of Fancies looks to punish your opponent for having a ton of cards in their hand because it can rapidly mill them out. Both of these effects work really well together too, as forcing your opponent to draw will also decrease the number of cards in their deck, while also making the second activated ability more powerful. The Folio has seen a bit of play in the sideboards of Control decks and Pioneer, where it can be brought in against other Control decks. It represents some pretty serious inevitability, and it isn't very easy to interact with, and Control players already like drawing lots of cards and holding onto them, so it can mill them out pretty quickly. It doesn't have any points since 2020 though. At number 9, it's Thought Eater. For one generic and a blue, the Eater is a 2/2 flyer. Back in the days of Odyssey, that was an incredibly efficient creature, so it comes with an effect that is mostly downside. It reduces your maximum hand size by 3. In other words, you now have to discard down to 4 at the end of your turn. The Eater gained all of its points in Odyssey Block Constructed, and it was played in a blue-green deck that can make the effect have some upside. Odyssey Block had 3 different mechanics that could give you value for discarding. Threshold, which makes your cards better if you have 7 or more cards in your graveyard, Flashback, which lets you cast cards from your graveyard, and Madness, which allowed you to cast a card for an alternate cost when you discarded it. With all of that going on in the format, discarding down to 4 cards every turn could actually result in some pretty powerful effects. Thought Eater never gained any points outside of Block Constructed though. At number 8, it's Kanan. He's a 5 loyalty planeswalker that costs 4 generic and 2 blue, and he qualifies for this list because of his ultimate, a -10, which exchanges your hand and library and gives you an emblem with "you have no maximum hand size." It's pretty important to have that emblem, because most of the time, the -10 is going to give you a heck of a lot more cards than 7, and it would be pretty bad if you had to discard down to 7 after going through all the work necessary to get that ultimate online. He also has a +2 that draws 2 and then puts a card from your hand on the bottom of your library, and he has a -2 that makes a dog creature token that has power and toughness each equal to the number of cards in your hand. Obviously enough, the tokens that the -2 creates are going to be absolutely massive if you get to the ultimate. Overall, Kanan makes for a fairly impressive planeswalker, thanks to its ability to add to the board and generate card advantage. Kanan saw some play in standard blue-white control decks, where he made for a decent win condition. He hasn't gained any points since rotating out of standard though. At number 7, it's Finale of Revelation. For X and 2 blue, this sorcery draws you X cards, and if you pay 10 or more for X, you get a big upgrade. You shuffle your graveyard into your library, draw X cards, untap up to 5 lands, and you get to turn off your hand size restrictions for the rest of the game. Obviously, if you can pump that mana into it, the fact you get 5 mana back is huge, because you're going to be able to play some of the cards you just drew. Unsurprisingly, its points have all come in decks capable of generating lots of mana. In Standard, it was sometimes played alongside Nissa, who shakes the world, whose ability to double the mana your forests produce makes it pretty easy to pay 10 or more for X. More recently, it's seen play in Lotus Field decks and Pioneer. These decks specialize in untapping the fields as much as possible in a single turn for insane amounts of mana, and the Finale is both something to spend all that mana on and a way to untap your fields. It looks like it's going to keep gaining points in Pioneer in the future. At number 6, it's Jin-Gitaxias, Core Augur. For 8 generic and 2 blue, Jin Gitaxias is a 5/4 with flash, and it has 2 insane effects, as a 10 mana card should. The first draws you 7 cards during your instep every turn, and the other reduces each opponent's maximum hand size by 7. In other words, you get to draw a ton of extra cards while making it impossible for your opponent to ever have cards in their hand during your turn. That combination generally means you're going to have a massive arsenal of cards while your opponent is completely defenseless, and you don't need me to tell you that that combination means you're going to win the game. The fact that Jin has flash means you can make it happen out of nowhere too. Because of its huge mana cost, people very rarely actually cast the core Augur. Jin Gitaxias has gained all of its points in Legacy Reanimator decks, which have the ability to put Jin Gitaxias into play in the extreme early game with a card like Reanimate. If you can make your opponent discard down to 0 cards that early in the game, they truly have no hope of winning. That said, Jin doesn't have any points since 2018, as there are simply better reanimation targets out there these days. At number 5, it is Tomo, the Moon Sage, a 4 loyalty planeswalker that costs 3 generic and 2 blue. She qualifies for this list because of her ultimate, which makes it so that anytime a card goes to your graveyard from anywhere, you get it into your hand. In addition to that, it also makes it so you have no maximum hand size. And that's pretty important in this case because this is another ultimate that would be a heck of a lot worse if you didn't get to have no maximum hand size because you're going to have tons of cards in your hand. Remember, you get cards back to your hand no matter how they go to the graveyard. This means if a card gets milled, discarded, or destroyed, you get it back. But perhaps the thing that makes it the craziest is that it also counts when you cast an instant or sorcery spell, and it would resolve and go to your graveyard. So if you're casting something like a counterspell, you just keep on getting it back. Yeah, that's definitely an ultimate that's a game ender. Her other 2 abilities are pretty great too. Her +1 lets you tap a permanent down and it doesn't untap during your next untap step, and her -2 draws you a card for each tapped creature a player controls. Don't forget that you can target yourself with that. While in block and standard, Tomo is a great planeswalker for control decks, but she hasn't gained any points since 2013. At number 4, it is Enter the Infinite. For 8 generic and 4 blue, this sorcery draws cards equal to the number of cards in your library, and then you put a card from your hand on top of your library. It of course also shuts down the maximum hand size restriction until your next turn, which is pretty important when you draw this many cards. You can get around this problem by getting Omniscience into play. Omniscience is itself super expensive, but you can put it into play with Show and Tell, and once you do that, you can cast Enter the Infinite for free and draw your whole library, and you can also play all of those cards for free thanks to Omniscience. Unsurprisingly, casting every single card in your library in a single turn usually wins you the game. In addition to success in Legacy, Enter the Infinite has also seen play in Pioneer in a deck that could actually cast it. Between 2019 and 2020, it was in Lotus Field decks, which we discussed earlier. Once you drew your whole library, you could cast Thassa's Oracle to win the game. It's also found some more limited success in Possibility Storm decks in Pioneer, which only run one other sorcery in the deck, so if they can tutor it up and cast it, they get to cast Enter the Infinite for free. So far, Enter the Infinite doesn't have any points in 2022, but it is arguably the most powerful sorcery in the entire game, and it is a card that should be considered for any deck that can produce a bunch of mana, or they can cast super expensive things for free. So I don't think we can count it out entirely. At number 3, it's Nezahal, Primal Tide. For 5 generic and 2 blue, Nezahal is a 7/7 with a whole bunch of effects, one of which makes it so you have no maximum hand size. Nezahal also can't be countered, draws you a card anytime your opponent casts a non-creature spell, and you can discard 3 cards to exile Nezahal and return it to the battlefield tapped under its owner's control at the beginning of the next end step. This combination of abilities makes it pretty hard for your opponent to effectively interact with Nezahal. If they want to use removal, you're going to be getting a 2-for-1 out of it at the very worst, since you'll draw a card, and if they can remove Nezahal, you can use those extra cards to blink it out to dodge removal. Nezahal has seen play in control decks in multiple formats where it's usually a sideboard card that is brought in mirror matches. It's pretty difficult for an opposing control deck to beat Nezahal, and it will keep seeing sideboard play as a result. At number 2, it is Renin 7. This planeswalker costs 3 generic and 2 green and enters with 5 loyalty. It makes it on this list because of the -8, which returns all permanent cards from your graveyard to your hand and gives you an emblem that gives you no maximum hand size. As we've seen several times in this video, including the no max hand size effect is necessary in order for this ability to really feel powerful. It also has a -3, which generates a Tree Folk token with reach that has power and toughness each equal to the number of lands you control. It's usually pretty amazing when a planeswalker can generate a body to protect itself, and this huge Tree Folk with reach usually does a pretty good job of making sure that Renin 7 sticks around. In addition to the fact that the token can also just win you the game. On top of that, Renin 7 has a +1 that lets you reveal the top 4 of your library, and then you put all lands you reveal into your hand, and the rest of those cards go into your graveyard. It also has a 0 ability that lets you put all lands from your hand onto the battlefield. All of Renin 7's points so far have come in Standard, where it's been the top curve in mono-green aggro decks and a great value planeswalker for Jund control. It's still in Standard right now, but it has slowed down significantly since Isuka's Chariot rotated out of the format. That vehicle allowed you to copy the powerful Treefolk token Renin 7 can generate. It has some significant time left in the format and is likely to gain more points, but it's never going to catch the number 1 card on the list, which is Seagate Restoration. This sorcery costs 4 generic and 3 blue, and draws cards equal to the number of cards in your hand +1, and it turns off your max hand size. It also happens to be a modal double-faced card, which means it has another side you can choose to play instead. In this case, you've got Seagate Reborn, a land that can tap for blue mana, and it enters tapped unless you pay 3 life. While neither side of this card is individually very impressive, I mean, one side is a really overcosted draw spell and the other is a bad island, the fact that this card is modal is a huge deal. It means that if you draw this early, you've got a land that you probably want, and if you draw it late when you don't want any more lands, you can cast it as a spell for a pretty powerful effect. That kind of flexibility is so good that the Seagate sees play in every Magic format it's legal in. It also gets some bonus points for being a land that is also blue when you need it to be. This is important in Modern Legacy and Vintage, because it's a land that you can pitch to cards like Subtlety, Force of Will, and Force of Negation, which are incredibly important cards, and getting to cast them for free is a huge deal. Seagate Restoration is going to remain the number 1 card on this list for the foreseeable future. So, those are the top 10 cards that mess around with hand size. Do you want to be able to have more cards in your hand, or would you like to make it so your opponent can have fewer? Then check out the description, where you can find a direct Card Kingdom link for each card that appeared in the video. If you want to make sure you catch future videos, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. Thanks for watching.